Just what I got.
They're the same,
But it's the year 2012, 13.
Yeah, it's two, don't look, just look at
Yeah,
20.
that's
Okay, so we'll look at this one.
the other map is regional map. That's just how the district
Oh, yeah, I
is
see.
organized. Okay. But the most important one that I'm discussing now would be related to board district map.
Which is 13, 14, right?
13, 14.
13, 14, okay.
Okay. Presently, we have,
That's school.
Which one do you want?
This one.
13, 14, 12, 13.
That's for how many schools are, right?
You want that.
Attendance line.
I want to see
The
the attendance line, the school board district lines.
Right.
We have, the present time, we have 9 district lines.
But that's okay,
That-
just use the one that says.
The issue is, Chairman, is there's two
I
different
didn't realize
maps.
that.
Right. So that's- Let's have everybody have the same map.
Yeah, everybody just map.
We had to have more made, so some of them are, copies of the right one, but that's the right one.
All right, 12, 13.
All of them, so it's the right one. Okay. At the present time, we have 9 board districts. We have 2 at-large seats. Number 9 and number 8. Okay, those are the at-large seats. By law, when citizens vote May the 20th, they will be voting on 7 school districts.
Equal size.
With equal size, there are 2 concepts to this, and that's what we want to discuss today. The legislators asked that the board consider a recommendation, and it's only a recommendation, to be made to the legislators. All right, today, to get to that point, I wanted to make sure that we discuss some concepts, and it's very important that we discuss the concept. There's basically 2 concepts from the standpoint that are variables that we want to discuss that would lend itself to the concept that we would discuss, and that is the concept of 1 man, 1 vote. The other one is equally populated, 7 equally populated attendance areas, or districts, I'm sorry, or 1 man, 1 vote to be included in all of those. And it depends on who you talk to, is how this is interpreted.
Can you explain the word?
I think he's saying district-wide, county-wide voting. Is that what you're saying versus district?
1 man, 1 vote means that the 7 districts would reflect the racial makeup of the total county. That's 1 man, 1 vote.
So be more specific.
1 man, 1 vote would reflect, you don't want to violate the voting, the voting of any particular school or any district. Now that's the interpretation. Now,
Whose interpretation?
the legislators.
No, but
Now, the other one would be equally populated, meaning that each district, if each district would have 90,000 people or similar throughout the district. Now, it depends on who you talk to, and that's why it's so important that we discuss this today, because it's not my interpretation that we're dealing with here today. It's the interpretation of the legislators and how they look at building and developing these districts. So that's what we will be discussing. We will arrive at hopefully some conclusion today in terms of the concepts that we can give to the legislators so that they can develop the district lines accordingly. It may mean that they would stay exactly the way they are, with the exception of some options of eliminating the 2 at-large seats. That's a possibility. And I'm saying possibility because this board will not make that decision. The legislators will make that decision. However, I hope that we would come to some consensus today to make some recommendations to the legislators as to how we would want the district maps to look. Mr. Silverton.
Dr. Johnson, let me just say one thing. You know, having been a school board member and been in the situation where we had to make our changes were made because of the census. But really, you have an opportunity to make recommendations, and they may fly and they may not. The legislature may totally disregard what you presented, but what you presented should be with some rationale as to why it's fair and why it's appropriate. You have to be able to demonstrate that there has been some thought into it, but again, also recognize that they could kick it to the curb.
That's my
Mr.
presentation.
Cameron.
Point of clarity, Mr. Chairman. When you say one man, one vote, and they look at the county as a whole, if we say that, are they asking us if the county is 80% black, 80% African American? Are they saying that the board composition should be 80% African American?
That's how some interpret one man, one vote.
Your lawyer over there is saying, he's saying that.
Well, someone will know more about that than me would be.
That's why I asked the question.
Actually, that minorities will have the ability to elect a representative of their choice. It may or may not be a Hispanic or Asian or minority, but it should be someone of their choice.
Okay.
So it doesn't presuppose the color of the person who's elected. It's just that the people who are voting will have the opportunity to elect a representative of their choice.
So the district would be then be cut, assigned, so that we could influence that vote. Being that, I guess if you said if South DeKalb had a large minority percent, the district would be drawn, the line would be drawn that we could actually have enough people to catch that vote and say this is the representation that we want for a particular South DeKalb.
But that's one of the variables. The board, as Ms. Bowie pointed out, along that line, one of the challenges we've had in DeKalb is that the organization of thought, and we may decide as a district, you all may decide, that it might be better to have districts that will protect minority voter strength, but also might generate a more diverse composition within the district themselves.
Okay.
So, I mean, these are there. What she said, though, was accurate. You know, having served in the legislature, having been chairman of the Black Caucus doing a reapportionment process, all bets off when it gets to the legislature. That at the end of the day, and it's not a formal process, it's informal. It doesn't happen necessarily in public view. And how the lines are ultimately drawn is left up to the wisdom and the discretion and the happenstance of the men and women in the DeKalb delegation, because ultimately they will make the decision.
Okay, thanks.
A couple of comments, having spent a lot of time on this issue 2 years ago and having looked at it closely. And I think it's important to have some context. So the legislature passed specific legislation to DeKalb County. And that's sort of the first thing to understand. That there's a general piece of legislation, which is 20-2-52, which talks about the composition of school boards and size. But then they passed .1, which pertains just to us. It doesn't say that, but the only way it can be interpreted is it talks about county, a school district that has both a host and a SPLOST, and we're the only ones that fit that bill in the state. And so it fixed the size of the school board at 7 districts, approximately equal size districts. And, you know, there was a lot that went in that background. Second, which is more of a process thing, is, you know, we're dealing on a very tight timeline because the legislature is going to end much earlier than it has historically. So regardless of how we personally feel about it, the chance to redraw district lines in any substantial way is probably non-existent because the expectation is that they're going to adjourn probably no later than March 14th. And you might not even be able to get the notice requirements that are required when you're redrawing districts in the time that's left, given that it's already February 8th. So I have been, as I've expressed to the chairman, an advocate that whatever we do we should in some ways sort of aim low, minor tweaking. If there's a neighborhood that got split up last time, things of that sort. Because I think anything more ambitious, what we'll only end up with is exactly what we have, which is the 7 existing local districts. Third, I think there is one overarching issue that the legislation addresses, but I think there might be room because it might not require the same notice requirements, which is about staggered versus non-staggered terms. So, because we're special, we get our own law. The law as to staggered or non-staggered, it's up to basically, it's much more general for other school districts. In the legislation pertaining to us, it actually, point one, we're the point one group, actually says that we're staggered. But I think there's an argument for asking the legislature to change that. And I would cite sort of the following things. One is, and I will make this at a personal level, some of us already went through, the even number of districts went through kind of a truncated terms because of this reduction of the size of the legislature. So I think it is likely, not absolutely, that the odd number of districts would probably be the ones with 2-year terms. That's people's self-interest, but I don't think that's really the major issue. But just as a way of explanation, just something to think about. Right, so 1, 3, 5, 7. But
You on camera.
2, 4, and 6. But I think more broadly, I think there's 2 arguments. I at a personal level think that when all seats are up for election at the same time, that there's more focus on the school board elections. I think when there's a tendency to stagger them, people are only engaged at their local districts. And a demonstration, at least that theory, is what just happened in APS, which is that there are now 6 of the new 9 seats are now occupied by new board members because all the seats were up for election at the same time. And so I think there was a certain degree of energy around that election that gets dissipated when only part of a jurisdiction is engaged. The other thing is the argument used to be, well, God forbid we had an entirely new board that was created as a result of the election. Well, we are the beta test for an entirely new board. There's not a board member on here that has served more than a little over 13 months. So the 3 of us who went through the election process started last January, the other 6 of you joined in March, and I think it's worked out okay. And so the argument that it would be debilitating to a system, that was often the argument about having staggered terms, I think is disproven by what we've been able to do.
Is that part of your discussion as to whether or not the terms are staggered? Is it the lines or is it?
I think it has to be because the legislature's running out of time.
We were, like I said, it depends on who you talk to and different, many interpretations. The vice chair and I, we were on the line together when we got the directions from the president of the legislative, of the county delegation, which specifically asked us for a recommendation related to the district lines. Now, in accordance with the law, in the law, Mr. Orson just mentioned about the law itself. Now, and any concepts that we feel pertinent to it, because I have heard many comments from many different people about different interpretations, even discussing keeping it exactly the way it is, which many feel that would be against the law because the present law is 7, not 9 board districts. So we were asked specifically to give them a recommendation, and thinking through that, we thought that we should give them the concepts that we want so that they can come up with how the lines will be drawn, because we don't have all of the component parts that go into drawing these lines. We don't have the population, the minority population, the majority population. We don't have all that data, but we can give them a conceptual framework of what we think they should consider when they draw the line. That was the intent.
Right. So I had a couple of quick comments. One is, I think because we're just making a recommendation and the legislature can listen or not listen, we can recommend anything we want. We can recommend staggering, we can recommend that, it have 100 districts, we can recommend whatever we want. So I don't think we should get too caught up in what we can actually change, because if we're just providing a conceptual framework, I think as long as we agree on what we're recommending and they can listen or not listen, we can recommend whatever we feel appropriate. There were 3 things I actually thought would be productive to talk about, and I have a perspective on each of those, unsurprisingly, and I'll throw those out there. One was this staggered versus not staggered concept. I actually do think it would be productive to make a recommendation on that. This represents a unique opportunity where we can seamlessly switch from a staggered to a non-staggered system. And I would love to hear what other folks think. I think that a non-staggered system where everyone's up for election at the same time can be helpful because it can promote more widespread change. I mean, we saw a period over the last 18 months where I would say a majority of the county was actually very dissatisfied with the performance of their elected officials, but only had the option to change a small number of those elected officials. And I think allowing voters of the county to all participate in a more sweeping change would probably be both aligned with what we're used to in most legislative bodies, I mean, the U.S. Senate notwithstanding, but also would allow for more dramatic change when it's called for. And it also puts a referendum on each board to perform or to face together the consequences of that underperformance. So that would be my perspective on that. On the districts and the, how to align the 7 districts. Look, I have a strong perspective here. This is, you all receive a lot of emails and phone calls. I really receive a lot of emails and phone calls. This is one of the few issues where I think the community is actually not concerned about the way it's broken up. I have not received a lot of concern. I'd love to hear if other people have about the districts being apportioned incorrectly in some way, that the lines are gerrymandered in some way. I haven't heard a lot of that. And to me, I mean, they look a little funny in some places, but I've seen very gerrymandered maps before, and this doesn't appear to me to be one of those. I kind of favor a very conservative approach here. There's a lot of instability in the system, and so I think whatever we can do to promote stability would be good. My understanding is the census hasn't been updated for this, so that these still represent population equivalent, roughly population equivalent districts. Is that right?
Well, it was based on the 210.
They were done by the census.
Right. So they are updated.
So they
for
might
the
be a little bit
decennial.
out of.
Right,
out
with the
of line.
decennial adjustment they were.
And so, in my understanding, and I think the community's understanding, is that we're going to go from 9 districts to 7 geographic districts, eliminating the at-large districts, that the district configuration would remain largely the same. And so my vote would be for an unchanged perspective there, that we don't do anything radical, because I think that's what the community's expecting. The third issue no one's brought up yet, and I'll raise, and again, I think we can make a recommendation even if we're not asked to. It's surprising to me that we allow 7 months of time to lapse between an election and when someone takes office. It's surprising. And I understand why the election takes place very early, so I'm not debating that. I think whether for this election or future elections, it might be worth considering whether we shorten the time from the election to when people take office. Because I have a feeling that, especially if the whole board were up for election, that could create a lot of perverse incentives over the course of 7 to 8 months with a lame duck, for lack of a better term, board and incoming board members. And I have a feeling that could be disruptive. And so I would be in favor actually of seeing, again, whether this election or future elections, a shorter period of time between the election and those take office, which I think now is around 7 months.
Could I just make a point of clarification to that?
And I'm okay, if Dr. Morley's okay, just let them have a point of clarification, but.
Yeah.
It's completely a creature of the legislature which has bounced these nonpartisan elections around. The constitutionally office can't start, I don't believe, until 2015, January 1st. So it's really about a matter of timing. In 2008, the election was actually the general election in November. And then they started backing it up. We're grouped with judges and other nonpartisan primaries. So that's a policy decision the legislature has made for every nonpartisan election. So everybody who's in a nonpartisan election is in exactly the same position. And their argument about moving it, I think, from the general election was that sometimes, particularly depending on what year it was, it got so far down the ballot that some of the nonpartisan elections kind of got lost in the general election ballot. So I completely understand the point, but it's probably a conversation the SBA and other
Legislative.
office of municipal, you know, a lot of other people who are gonna have to sort of come behind this if we.
Well, and that's why I said, I don't think we can make an impact now, but if we can recommend whatever we want, I would like to see that issue raised. And I don't know that we can solve that, it would take larger, but as long as we can just say, we think this is a problem, and we hope conceptually you guys will fix this, I view that as a problem, a 7-month gap. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Bowie. Just from a timeline standpoint, Chairman, when, and to Mr. Orson's talk about the shortened session, did the delegation request, they give us a specific date for this, or how soon do we need to officially recommend, take a vote and recommend and get it back to the delegation?
3 weeks ago, because when we got the call, it was around about that time. Was it not?
Yeah,
Around
yes.
3 weeks
In
ago.
the middle of January.
But in terms of the timing, we had it on the agenda last week. It was suggested that we move it to this week. So the point is, in terms of the timeline, because they would have to make a decision soon, or it depends on the changes, or
They
if
know
any
it's
changes.
So my recommendation.
They
They
know
know
it's
it's
coming.
coming. They
Yes.
know that we are not.
They are
They know it's
expecting
coming.
it, yes.
My recommendation is that the board today, if we can, either way, can we make a vote today, or do we have a special meeting this week to just be able to satisfy our delegation, our responsibility to the delegation, and get a recommendation to them, because I think they've been waiting. And so with that being said, can we do it today?
Where's your attorney? This is a publicized meeting, correct?
Right.
And
It's a notice
as
meeting.
an agenda item, it would seem to me, I'm not an attorney, and you got one here somewhere.
He's right here.
So it's appropriate for them to take.
No,
take
everything,
action
Mayor, yeah.
on those things, is that correct? Hmm?
It's okay, then take long.
Yeah, I thought so.
Okay.
The attorney says that it's okay. I'm willing to,
Yes,
We can go by consensus.
but you can vote, you know, take action, yes. Dr. Moore,
Yeah,
sorry.
my question is, what's the worst thing that can happen if it remains the same?
The same as
If we
what?
say we want 9. Pardon me?
Same 9 or same 7?
Same 9, if that was a recommendation, what's the worst that can happen?
Well,
How about that? play out?
Only thing I can tell you, the only thing I can tell you would be, I have been asked that question several times. I have asked the question several times. I have been told that the law says 7. That's what I was told. Now, whether or not, but go back to Mr. Coleman's point, if we want that, what's wrong with listening? Now, again, because it's only a recommendation that we're giving to the legislators in the first place. So if we want to keep it at 9, let us write it down that that is one of our recommendations.
Because when I think about it, if we're beginning to look at the strides and the gains that we have made as a board, and because we're under a mandate, and SACS is saying what we need to do and where we ought to be, and those sorts of things, and we know that this ship is still limping to try to get to the other shore, I think that the legislature, if they're really, really bought into and concerned and in doubt about education, can say that how do you begin to topple the leadership in the midst of that ship out in the middle of the sea trying to get to the other side? And it concerns me that most certainly when you talk about newness, it's almost like coming in and bringing in a new superintendent in the midst of this. People's mindset, their ideas, and their passions will change. And will they follow the same process and procedures? Will they have the same beliefs? Will they still be bought in? And I think we came in under a different term, because it wasn't like you just decided that we're gonna have this election and have 9 board members. We came in and there was basically, in a sense, a mandate that was put upon us to turn this thing around. So it's different than people coming in and saying, we're gonna elect 9 new people. So it concerns me that if we were to bring in just 7, two were to go off or whatever, and 7 new people, or 9 new people came on, that it would disrupt what we have actually been building here for the last 12 months or so. And that needs to be taken into consideration. And I think that I would like to see that recommendation be made, that we look at, you know, what's the worst thing that can happen? What would it hurt if we did recommend it? Because I would just be concerned, and I think the public would be concerned, because I'm getting from people, oh, what a great job, we're so pleased, we're so glad, because the board is that governing body that is leading, and they're saying, even when you all are communicating with each other, how you look at each other, how you relate to each other, the things that you're actually doing. And I just, as a taxpayer too, it concerns me.
Yeah, there are two problems with recommending 9 or having 9 be accepted. The first one is that there is a significant body of the populace that wants 7. So I don't think it would be in our purview to attempt to undermine that. But probably the most significant element of that is that law, and I'm going on memory of having read it a couple of years ago. It is tied to SPLOST dollars. If you have more than 7 members, you don't get SPLOST dollars. And so I don't think we are in a position, nor do we want to take the position, unless we're prepared to change the legislation, that we want to recommend 9 at the expense of SPLOST dollars.
But
Usually, if we recommended the delegation choose to do so, then they would also follow that all the way out to the end, inclusive of SPLOST.
Before the governor, I'm sorry.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
So a couple things here. One, you know, I've been an advocate for a long time of 7 seats, so there's not a situation unrelated to people of 7 here that I would feel comfortable supporting a 10 or 7 seat school board. Because I've thought the board, and it has nothing to do with, again, the individuals here, was too large, and that if you look across the state, some of the boards that have been the most dysfunctional, whether it's, it may not be causation, maybe it want to be correlation, but also not. Clayton, Atlanta, and the
Those ones you know about.
Right, I understand. I
Don't
understand. But I also know that those are 3, to be fair, that those are 3 of the largest school systems in the state. And a lot of the 5 are very small school systems. And again, I don't know if it's correlation or causation, but there is. So I've been a long-term advocate of 7. Secondly, Thad is right. We've got a reprieve on SPLOST because the law did say you basically had to have 7 or you lose your SPLOST. You could be tied up in some litigation. In fact, because we were proponents of SPLOST, but then we got hammered by the fact that the legislature pulled the rug out from underneath us and said, anyway, related, even though they are separate considerations, they were tied together. Third, you know, I understand the point about we can ask for anything, but if you ask for anything and it's beyond the pale of what the legislature is going to do, you get nothing. Because that's what happened in the last go-round with board maps, is that the legislature said, basically went from nothing to asking for some complete reorganization of the map, and the legislature said, forget it, we're not listening to anything, we don't think you've actually done this. And so my first comment, which was, I think we need to be, I said low, but moderate in what we ask for, I think is prudent if we actually want to have an input in the process. And again, this also comes down to the fact that the legislature is probably gone in about 40 days, because they can't raise any money while they're in session. So they need to get out of there as quickly as possible. And I think the expectation is probably around mid-March as opposed to April, as it historically been. They'll be out of there, particularly because the election this year is in May. And so the more complicated we ask for, I think we're likely just to have it ignored. And so if there's something we think is really important, and I come back, I think the staggered versus non-staggered may be the most important issue in there. I think it could just be lost in the legislature's responses. Look, we've got a law, it says 7, we're just dealing with that, we're not going to touch anything else.
Thank you, Dr. Bowie. Just for clarification, what I've heard so far at the table has been various suggestions from 7 districts to 9 districts, status quo recommendation, or do we want to align ourselves with the 7 as 1? Do we keep the same district lines, I guess, or do we a little tweaks in there? terms, non-staggered versus staggered. That's another suggestion or vote. And then the big picture one was primary in May or November. So those are the four things that I have written down that as a group, we should vote on. Is there any comment, or did I miss anything, or does anybody feel we should yank one of those off of there? And by going with this, I guess, facilitator, how do you want to handle?
Well, you asked the question, but I think we should do it with the others before your questions answered.
Fair, that's
We should come
exactly.
back to that. And Ms. Coleman was next.
That was great. I like that, and I like breaking it down. I might suggest that we go from least controversial to most controversial in terms of the vote, if that makes sense, because I heard a lot of, or I saw a lot of head shaking around the staggered versus non-staggered, and I think that's, you could at least get that done quickly. About the recommendation on a primary, which I don't think is beyond the pale, but is certainly beyond our power to enact. So if we thought that was right, we could just say, you know, we think this should change in the future. And then the controversial thing is the 7 versus 9, and whether we change lines, which I would prefer to address last, because you know, that'll take the most time. The question I have in my head, I know we're talking about this, what I'm trying to do is be, so I do think there are constraints with SPLOST, et cetera. I'm trying to be neutral in terms of who is occupying board seats now, because we're setting policy for the future. And I certainly would like to work with everyone on this board again, the super districts, the regular districts, et cetera. Agnostic of individual names against seats and that kind of stuff. I have a hard time understanding the justification for at-large seats for two different modes of electing people within the same legislative boundaries. If that makes sense. In the same legislative body, obviously we have multiple situations in which there are two bodies elected differently. Within the same body, I'm struggling to understand why we would have district aligned and at-large seats. What the positive justification for that. I've seen nefarious justifications of that in the past, not here, but in other voting situations. And so before I were willing to kind of support either, because we could also recommend 7 at-large seats, right, which would be more consistent too. And I'd actually be more open to that than a mixture of at-large and district seats. I'd rather have district seats or at-large seats, but not the mix of the two. Because the mix of the two makes me really concerned that there was a historical justification for that was not dedicated to the best outcomes for students, but probably related to specific goals of the people running for election at that time. Not this board, but previous boards. So I like the consistency of having one or the other if we were to reduce. And Dr. Morley's point is a great one. I mean, I think we're all tempted to say, let's leave it as is because this is a good board. I think, you know, I would love to work with all of you. But just thinking in policy terms, it would make me concerned to have a mixed election as district and non-district based. And if someone knows a good justification for that or why that would be positive things for the students of the county, then I would like to understand that.
In terms of the feedback that I get, and certainly I like the chemistry on this particular board, and I would love to see everybody stay. For that reason, I too would love to see it as a recommendation because we don't have any control anyway. And to me, it's better to give the legislators more than one recommendation in that they would be able to consider more. So I would like to see recommended either keeping the 9, which by law, you know, it's up to them to decide whether or not that's a valid recommendation or not. I would even go so far as to say 7 at-large seats. That gives everybody a fair opportunity to be represented. 7 at-large seats is what I would see, or 5. Well, the thing about it, everything is relative. It depends on who you're talking to. Everything is relative according to who you're talking to around this table.
I agree. I think
So that's my point.
Okay, Dr. Irwin.
Yes, I kind of, well, I do agree with Dr. Morley. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I like the 9 members at this table. I like to continue to work with this board. I would like to have a recommendation that we keep the 9 for the next 4 years and not have a staggered board, and then after that, let the legislature reduce the district down. Because I think we still need to maintain stability and go the same direction. I would hate to see that kind of turnover happen here. There was justification, my justification is that it's working quite well right now. I think really that we need to see it out and keep the non-board members listed at this table, or non-seats, period, so.
You know, in my vocabulary, can't does not exist, so we need to take that, put it up, think, cross it out. Anything is possible, anything can happen. When the governor came in last year, decided that he was going to remove the elected officials, and he appointed 6, things can be changed, and laws can be changed. I think that we have to begin to look at what is in the best interest of the children and the community that we serve in this district as a whole. And laws are meant to be changed as necessary to be applicable to fit what are the needs of the people and the citizens. And we are the citizens, and the children especially should be first and foremost. But the other thing, if we have to do it all at large or how we want to do it, you know, that would be fine. But I think, and we have researchers, Thad, you know, the researcher, and John, the researchers, and like to see research, you know, there's a methodology. And you have to be able to give your specific reasoning and rationale for why you want to defend this position. And what better defense for defending this position that we don't disrupt this what we have going here, as Dr. Irwin said, to make sure that we get done and achieve the goals and that we have actually set forth, the superintendent's plan, all the things that are in place. And so I think that unless we actually take a stand for something, we'll fall for anything and be able to say, here's what we're looking for, here's the reason why we believe this. So if we give 2 suggestions, I would like to see the 9 be kept the way it is and be able to give that reason and rationale for why we want it to happen this way, and basically to be able to use and say the children and the success, academics, the people, the morale, all those things. So all we have to do is come up with the 11 action items for advanced ed. That would be enough to be able to substantiate, here's the reason why.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I speak not as the school board, I mean as the superintendent, but kind of channeling former member of the legislature, board and so forth, his story. The at-large issue, as you clearly stated, was the issue around dilution of minority voters. And that's why the Justice Department looked at it with some concern and doubt. But as you know, Section 5 has been eliminated. So that is not a pre-clearance issue anymore. So technically, from the issue of constitutional law and voting in Section 5, that's no longer an issue. It may have been one before the recent Supreme Court case, but it's not there. So jurisdictions can, in their own discretion, in my mind, establish at-large voting multi-member, because there's no Section 5. Secondly, what drives reapportionment is incumbency. It's real personal. And the only lines that matter are the lines that impact me from an elected official position. And so the real principle is that with the legislature is that whether or not they should respect incumbency in the drawing of the lines. And if this board takes a position that you shouldn't, then they could draw lines in the way they choose. But what drives the line development of reapportionment plan is that commons get protected. So one of the principles is that maybe you all want to look at it, is that something that this board wants to take a position on? That's just a point. And legislation, and maybe Mr. Orson can help me, this reapportionment was supposed to take place actually in 2010, wasn't it?
12, because it's the 10.
10 census.
It did occur in 12.
Right, but wasn't it delayed until this year? Wasn't this
No, the
supposed?
reduction of the elimination of 2 at-large seats was because there was a specific reason. The legislative council, when reviewing the legislation, failed to note that you could not truncate a sitting board member's term without a referendum. So they failed to have a referendum. You could do it legislatively as long as people could run to the end of their term. That would have required people to leave their term halfway through, and the only way you could do that was through a referendum, and they hadn't scheduled enough time for the referendum and the implementation. So that's why they delayed it.
So how was it delayed?
So they passed special legislation that said that this Act 52.1 implementation would be delayed until January 1st, 2015.
Well, to Dr. Moore's point, then if legislation was introduced to delay it, then in fact.
Right, but the
No, I'm not saying it should, I'm just getting to her point, is that legislatively, acts can be taken or not taken to impact the implementation.
right, but there was a quid pro quo to that, which was that even number seats were shrunk to 2-year terms. I mean, there was.
I'm not going there, it's
Right.
just,
So-
this is not a thing complete.
No,
Things can happen legislatively, which is what, I'm just agreeing with Dr. Moore. Does that make sense? That's
Right,
all.
right.
For whatever reason.
Mr. Orson, this is your turn.
So that last one, I've always been intrigued actually by district-wide at-large seats actually, but, and this was not a Section 5 issue, I believe it was Lansing Cherokee, Oklahoma County, which basically they had to move off of county-wide district Cs as being found as discriminatory. So I don't think if we were to do that, we would buy ourselves probably litigation in there. The court found that actually had a dilutional effect outside because it wasn't a pre-clearance issue. And so whether it was Cherokee, it was one of those counties north of us, was forced to go with it.
Fayette County recently.
Right, so.
Into district-wide had a dilutionary effect?
Yeah,
is
so,
what they found?
right, so they required local districts in there. And so really the only entities that still have that are the Public Service Commission, I think. Right, you live in a district, but you're elected statewide. And, right, it's easier for that Georgia Power to give donations. And so I think, well, again, I've always been personally intrigued by that. I think we would, and I don't, that's why the legislature, I think there's zero chance of them accepting that because they'll be aware of the recent litigation and they don't want to do anything to buy themselves litigation.
Georgia legislature?
It's
Well,
not a
that
comment.
is short
Oh.
for this.
I want to ask our two, just a
Yeah.
follow-up to these two who actually seem to know about the history. What is the, and maybe everyone else understands this, what is the dilutionary effect of district-wide voting versus
Local.
local district? Could you just explain how
I
that works?
think the court's interpretation was that, and I don't want to put it all in finances, but that money, because it's so much more expensive to run on a jurisdiction-wide basis, it requires a lot more money for you to raise, and so that it would offset, and this is traditionally the language of minority districts, so the majority of minority districts would still at a disadvantage because of the cost of running on that basis. And also, and I don't want to go into the weeds because I don't know all the details, there's also a disproportionate turnout. So there is the offset, even if you have a higher minority population, there's a risk that it's offset by the lower percentage turnout. And so I think probably for a combination, I don't hold me to that, but I think my recollection is that it's a combination of those reasons.
But without pre-clearance, an agreed party would have to sue, which would take 10 years. When you had Section 5.
It's not a Justice Department issue anymore.
No,
It's,
we could have objected to the creation and implementation of the district. Without Section 5, minorities really have very little recourse other than to spend a tremendous amount of money to litigate the issue that Mr. Orson just spoke to. So this is the result of that decision, that minorities in there don't have, and not minority in terms of ethnic or race, but it's in terms
Any
of,
minority.
it's in minority in terms of actual numbers. So minorities do not have that recourse. And I'm not talking racial minorities.
That's helpful. Thanks.
I like the status quo, 9, but I do not want to jeopardize our SPLOST. So I would be willing to support the status quo if we could throw in the caveat that only if whatever law is out there were to be changed so that we could participate in our SPLOST. And, because I think that would be a game changer if we voted for the best interests of the district and then lose our capital campaign, for whatever, just from a clarification standpoint.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Chief? Is SPLOST and host Is it two?
Well, there's a host and SPLOST, and so the way the legislature, you'll appreciate this, the legislature, to make it general legislation, as opposed to local legislation, they had to create generic terms, which is any jurisdiction that had a host and a SPLOST, which miraculously only applied to DeKalb County. But out of 180 school districts in the state of Georgia.
Oh.
Coincidence, that's
That's
coincidence.
coincidence.
Right, right.
Who authored the legislation?
You know,
I thought it was you.
You know, I may have done that before I left.
so as you know, there's the author and there's the godfathers.
Okay.
Right, the people whose names on the legislation may not have necessarily been the people who wrote the legislation.
Okay, they
So-
removed the thing.
So my guess is that the authors weren't from DeKalb County. The godfathers might have been from DeKalb County, people pushing.
Oh, I got you.
Right, so the trail was a little murkier. And so, and again, this is in the context of what I said before, I think it's important to note that the legislature has taken a very active and particular interest in our county, and has clearly gone to the extent of passing general legislation, even when it really is local legislation.
And Fulton County too, it's not just.
Right. And so to the extent that we're swimming against the tide, obviously we take a position on everything, I also think we have to be prudent in the position we take, because we will look like we are just ignoring what the legislature has already passed. And I do not think that helps us in our relationship there to try to, quite frankly, unring the bell that they rung, whether it was right or wrong. I think we've got to be mindful of that in terms of our ability to foster strong relationships with legislature.
I appreciate what you said, Orson, and I do think we have to foster positive relationships. They invited us to tell them what we dream. And one of the challenges that this county faces from its elected officials across the district in a variety of positions is we keep telling young people to dream. I chaired the Youth Leadership DeKalb program's outreach activities for 2 weeks. And one of their fundamental tasks was to do a program that said, what I dream for a greater DeKalb. And we can't ask them to dream and think out of the box and come up with ways to be creative and get the job done to improve their educational experience, their quality of life, and stay here as taxpayers, as adults who work in this community, and we not take the risk of doing the same. Saying that, I'd like to see us stay status quo. It'd be ideal if we were all able to do our work effectively well, and the citizens think well enough of us to invite us back. But should they not, having the balance that this represents, I think is important. I also think it's important for us to get clarity. The legislative give it, the legislative take it away. They can create laws, and we know it is a stroke of a pen, and a governor who strokes a pen behind the legislative. He came and said that he believed in what this body did to turn this district around. And that is our collective work. When we agree and when we disagree, we found a way to do it respectfully and with depth. And when we need research, we go get it. And if we have questions, we push and challenge. So I've got 3 things. Priority 1, stay at 9 with clarity.
Let's start.
Yes, it is status quo, but status quo has such a bad feeling.
Well, I just want to make sure I know.
Yes, so I'd like to see us consider proposing 9, recognizing that it's the same number, but it's not status quo. It's that we have done something effective as 9 that's different than a historical 9.
So stay at 9.
Stay at 9. You know, we're talking about flexibility, and status quo is not a good thing. So, I want us to shift how we use our language. Clarify the SPLOST, because if we're going to stay at 9, then we need all of the impending legislation that negatively impacts this district to also be addressed. Because the point of staying at 9 is to continue to make enhancements and improvements. I think John's point is very well taken. Drop stagger. Let's go straight ahead. Sorry, you guys, I know that you've done your campaigns and you've gone through this process before already, And the law does say that all of us, whether we were appointed, elected, came in on the staggered or returning, 2014 is it. So figure out how to do that if your desire is to stay here. And then I guess the third point, no staggered, is if we do go to 7 at large. So that's my priority list.
Okay, Mr. Coleman?
So I would actually, just to do the two quick things first, I would actually vote on this piece by piece, the 3 pieces we talked about, because I have a feeling we've got consensus or near consensus on a couple of these we've got further debate. And to get it off the table, so that we can talk about the issues that are more controversial, I would actually propose that we recommend dropping staggered terms and having non-staggered election, just as a standalone vote of the board. So I'm doing that now. I propose that we recommend to the legislature that we have non-staggered terms for school board members, irrespective of the rest of the configuration.
Could I just add a clarification of 4 years?
4 years,
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
that's-
4 years.
I'm asking, do I take over?
Oh, the superintendent.
Superintendent.
Superintendent has something to say.
So you defer to the chairman as.
It has been moved.
I defer, yeah.
It's been moved by Mr. Coleman and seconded by Dr. Irwin. Is there any discussion?
Just to make sure it's clarified that it's a 4-year term. Right. Could be
Non-staggered.
Non-staggered.
4-year terms, starting January 1st, 2015.
Correct.
Through 2018. That's 4 years, 15, 16, 17.
Yeah, correct.
It's like
I had to use my
elementary
hands,
school.
yeah. But it wasn't 11-year terms, I'd have had to take my shoes off.
No, for clarification purposes, want to make sure before we vote, we know what we're voting on. Exactly what we're voting on.
So I'm just
Your
going back.
action statement.
I move that we recommend to the legislature non-staggered 4-year terms for all board members, irrespective of the other configuration, beginning January 1st, 2015. And I think it's assumed that.
December 31, 18,
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yep.
Any
Is
further
this
discussion?
consensus or is this
This, we actually voted.
This includes this election cycle.
correct?
Correct, this is
Term
our
begins-
This would be
recommendation
the
for
first.
The
this.
term beginning January 1st.
Right, from May 20th.
And so what happens as far as the seats that we're looking at, the numbers?
Well, that's a different.
Separate.
Regardless of the number 6.
As I understand it, and I'm restating this for clarification purposes only, the only thing that we will be voting on now would be that everybody operate on the non-4-year term.
Non-staggered.
Non-staggered 4-year term. Non-staggered 4-year term. And that's the only thing we're voting on. All right, any further discussion? Hearing none, at this time I call for the vote, all in favor? I believe it's unanimous.
Thank you.
Got that off the table, thank you, Mr. Coleman. Back to
Could I say something?
I'm sorry. Sir?
I just want to reiterate something, and I'm not just saying this because you all are my bosses, but there's been 2 chamber meetings that I've attended with several board members were there. First at the state of this county address, and then earlier this week at the annual meeting. I have counted that this board has received 4 standing ovations.
I think 5.
Maybe 5
Yeah.
standing ovations from the business and the political leadership of this county for the work that you all have done. And I wouldn't count, but it's, right? So, and I'm just saying, don't underestimate the progress and the significance of the progress that this board has made. And I know you always have detractors and critics, and there's no one immune from that. But my impression is that this county, heck, this state is very much in support of the work that you all are doing. And the big concern is how will we be able to maintain over a long period of time? There will be some changes in superintendent in other places, but continuity is the issue. And to that extent, I think it presents a strong argument to continue what you all are doing lot of sentiment otherwise, but the camera just don't. And when the chamber, who's been some of our harshest critics, can now stand up, form a chair, and compliment each and every one of you on multiple occasions, I think that's
Yes. I certainly love working with all 9 of us, but I can tell you from my experience working with SPLOST when this issue was being hotly debated. I don't know how many people know the history of this, but there are a lot of them. And for purposes of conversation and clarity, it is not just the north end of this county who are very much interested in this board being at the number 7. The second point that I would make is that this decision was made prior to the board, the system falling into the conditions that it fell into. So the condition of the board and the system had little to nothing to do with the decision-making that went with this legislation. The third point that I would make, which is really probably the first one, is that because it is tied directly to SPLOST dollars, that there is a significant amount of risk to put on the table with respect to this issue that cannot be taken lightly. And then fourthly, which is probably the most salient point from my point of view, and it's twofold. One, because of those preceding factors, I think the chances of that legislation changing to eliminate SPLOST as a factor is a non-starter with this particular legislation. And I think to ask for it would be to publicly put the board in a position of being perceived as interested, both when you consider the number of people who want that, and you consider the dollars that are exposed. I think there would be a significant amount of conversations in the press about whether or not this board is actually serving in the interest of the district versus its own self-interest. And so I think if it's a battle to be fought, I think it should be one that's winnable. But if we're putting our names out there for the sake of the principle, I think there is a huge potential for public backlash on this that will not serve the board well, and I don't think it will end up being the legislation that will disconnect SPLOST from self.
And Thad, I most certainly hear what you're saying. I think that it's a privilege for the legislature to even ask us, our opinion or to make a recommendation. And a lot of times we have not because we ask not. And I think one of the things is, I've said over and over, money is important, but there's no price you can put on the heads of our children and education and our future. And so when we keep throwing money out there, it says a totally different thing if we're out there looking for money in order to better ourselves, but we're looking to be able to save a system, to save a community, and save a future. As a matter of fact, to, in a sense, predictability, go into the research and predict what's going to happen because we want to do what's best for our children. We have to, at some point, again, stand for something off anything. We have to stop sitting back and letting things happen. One of the most frustrating things at the FACTS meeting the other night, when we talk about flexibility, this would give a term of flexibility, was hearing those parents who thought that when we look at whether we're going to be IE2 or whether we're going to be charter, or what we're going to go, which way we're going, of those 3 choices, that it was the DeKalb County School District making those recommendations and not understanding the role that the legislature played. And where we're constantly coming back and reacting to situations instead of being proactively involved. Either we do something now, we're gonna pay dearly later. And if we cannot make a grand stand, and not only when Mr. Thurman was talking about the chamber saying what a wonderful job we've done, when the president of the Falcons got up there and said how much we were needed and how important we are as a school system. Everybody's recognizing And so when you have the ear, an opportunity presents itself to be able to get in. As Ms. Bowie said, we can't guarantee, Dr. Bowie said, we can't guarantee what's gonna happen. But I think we would be remiss in being able to put out there for that opportunity for it to possibly happen. And so I'm standing by, as I go with Dr. Carter, the recommendations that she made, that we look at that we look at putting forth at 9 and saying, here is our reason and rationale, because things can change, and we have to give that opportunity. But if we don't speak up now and say something, I think they would look much more, and at least the citizens, the people in where I've talked to, would look at us and say, you know what, why don't you all cut down that and knowing you're doing well and you're doing this and not, that would be a lot more self-serving than to say that we're actually standing for the best interest of our community and our children for education. And as an educator, I just think that the decisions I've seen in my more than 20-something years in education, to be able to go in that direction would be less prudent than to stand and say, action for what we believe would be in the best interest. That would be the most prudent decision to make at that time.
Thank you, Dr. Bowie. We're about to hit an hour on this topic. Just for everybody, I'm not pushing. Irregardless if we decide on 7 or 9, I would like to talk about one little tweak on the map, and I'll give the historical perspective. If you look at your map, and you look in between District 4, green, and District 2, which is wall, I guess, I have, and I'll circle on your map if you'd like, but right above the 2, you'll see a little, and y'all's are blue, yours is blue. This little spike up into the green is the corner of Claremont and La Vista. All right, so from a historical perspective, 3 years ago when the districts ran, when the previous board ran for election, and 3 of the 4 incumbents were defeated, the previous legislation changed the map so that, just like you said, Michael, the incumbents would not have to run against each other. So there was a adjustment made to the map to redraw one of the board members into District 2, and he lives in my neighborhood. I'd like to put him back in District 4. And that's so I would like to vote, I'd like to make a motion.
That goes under category tweet.
Tweet, this is the only,
Clarify.
Orson, why don't you want it?
He lives in his neighborhood.
if he were to live, if he had kids, they would go to Stafford or Hillsdale.
Why don't you want it? Yeah.
It was made as a determination for one of the incumbents.
Right.
So the 2 incumbents is running against each other.
It's 2 streets. It's 2 streets.
Okay.
So they took them out of District 4, which was Womack, and put them in District 2, so they didn't have to run against.
That's right. Right. He said it, right? Jim.
You all
It's early in the day.
You all get too anxious. So with that in mind, let's take a 5-minute break.
Thank you.
You didn't play, you didn't go outside to play.
Right on. It's good.
At this time, to resume, I would like to ask Mr. McMahan to complete his recommendation, and we will vote on that recommendation. That's the tweak now, only. That's the only thing we will be voting on. As a result of Mr. McMahon's recommendation.
Thank you, Chairman. And just for clarification, my motion is to transfer a portion of District 2 into District 4, and that portion, the boundaries are Claremont Road and La Vista Road that are currently in District 2, and just have those converted into District 4.
So, I'm just curious, which side of Claremont and La Vista is in 2?
on the
Just tell me.
Sagamore Elementary side.
That's my street. So is it the side that if you're driving on the Vista toward Toco Hills, is it the side that's to the right?
Correct,
Is currently in District 2,
correct.
even though it's half of Sagamore Hills?
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay, no problem. I just wanted to make sure I understood.
Yeah.
It was the left, the right side headed that way as opposed to the left.
Right, and that's where it circles right there. And that is exactly.
Moved by Mr. McMahan, second by Dr. Carter. Is there any discussion?
I'm sorry, give me a second.
It's moved and second, this is discussion.
What about the little?
This is the tweak. That's the little tweaking
The
that,
in 2 and 4.
Oh, okay.
That's all.
Oh, okay, that's all.
this is only related to the tweaking now. Have to clarify the vote. Any further discussion?
No, it's not.
No further discussion. All in favor, let me know by a show of hands. And this will be included in the recommendations to the legislature. And now I turn it back over to our facilitator.
I think we were at least determined.
He just stepped up. He realized he hadn't had a break.
Dr. Johnson, you were next.
In terms of, I concur with Dr. Carter in staying at 9 and sending a message that we want to maintain our credibility and good work, as well as our, wouldn't mind seeing the 7 at large. So those are the 2 that I recommend.
Mr. Orson.
As I started out, I am a consistent proponent of 7. I continue to be. I think I recognize that this board, I think individually and collectively, has done a great job, and I think it's been appropriately recognized. But I think that those accolades and recognition is not directly related to the size of our board, and that the policy decision that was made years before the replacement of this board, quite frankly, was one that was a policy belief of this legislature that went actually beyond DeKalb County. I mean, there's specific legislation tied to DeKalb County that the legislature, good or bad, we can have the arguments about. Legislature has taken a policy position in terms of it favoring 7-member school districts. And beyond, not to minimize, because I think it's one of the potential implications for SPLOST, I also think it's quixotic to be taking on that policy decision at a point that I think we will minimize our chance of having impact on things that are perhaps, we can have some success in what the legislature adopts, because I think to the point that we're taking on this policy decision, again, goes back before the replacement of the current, substantial portion of the current board, the legislature had spoken in terms of its strong preference for boards of 7, and that we will look, I think we will weaken our relationship with the state legislature. If we look to be challenging that policy decision, that was really more than DeKalb County, though it's direct implications for itself. I think that would do more harm than good.
Mr. Coleman.
So, and this will be, because I think I'm out of things to say on the topic, I'll just say kind of for the record, my final perspective here. Look, I'm trying to come from the perspective of agnostic to the personalities currently on the board, since I think we're setting policy. Actually, I think this is a good board. I think it's accomplished a lot of personalities involved here, good at what they do, and it'd be great to keep the group together. I think from a policy perspective, I can understand agnostic personalities, why we have a mixed electoral system, or why we reverse the decision to go from 9 to 7, given the popular support for that. Also, from what I've heard, past court decisions and legislative decisions have at least indicated that at-large representation can have a dilutionary effect. I mean, that was the reason that there have been stances against that. And so, with that in mind, for me, the simplest and fairest option would be to go to 7, as indicated previously, to have it in districts as they're currently represented here with our tweet, and not to have at-large positions. I think that would be consistent with the previous decisions of the legislature, what we've been working under the assumption of. It would leave us with a consistent mode of electing people in the county. And with actually likely, from what I've heard at least, be consistent with moves that courts and electoral bodies have taken in order to assure fairness and equity. So that's kind of my perspective on why I would veer towards 7 and why I would veer towards having geographic representation for those 7.
I had originally raised my hand to respond to something that was addressed earlier. And I think I've given you my preferences. I just want to make sure at this point, Dr. Johnson, that you've got to know that it's the 9 with the caveat that we're asking the delegation to also consider any funding legislation that would be impacted by staying at 9. Then just as a thought, to make sure that I'm understanding what was requested of us and by whom. My understanding is we are providing this information to the DeKalb delegation.
Yes, ma'am.
And that they will do as they see fit and deem best in whatever they might put forward to the General Assembly. So I think our due diligence is to give them our collective thinking in a prioritized manner. And I don't believe that it would be fraught with the notion that we are being disrespectful of what they've done historically, nor do I think it would be fraught with creating bad relationships in the General Assembly. These folks do this every day. They agree today, they disagree tomorrow, depending on what is most important for them and their constituency. So our delegation had an obligation to come to us as a courtesy and ask us what our recommendations were based on our experiences. We have an obligation to give them our preferences. My expectation is that they will not then turn on us and say, you disrespectful or ungrateful people for having the mere temerity to suggest we stay at 9, even though the legislation says stay at 7. That is the law. But every lawyer in this room knows that the United States Supreme Court sits in existence because they change laws every year. So, the General Assembly can change it if they so desire or not. But let's not presume that by putting our recommendations forward, that we are going to create ill will. I just find that uncomfortable, and it would say that our representatives aren't doing what they said they would do. So I'm very uncomfortable with the notion that we should not dare to do something different or propose something different because it's going to suggest to them that we don't respect them. They told us to give them choices. They will make good decisions based on what they believe is best on our input. But I would be really concerned if we thought that was going to then put this district in a negative light or position with either the delegation or the assembly as a whole. And maybe Mr. Superintendent can speak to their grudge holding experiences longer and deeper than before I came here. But that's not been my observation.
No permanent friends, no permanent enemies.
There you go. I think that we have to be mindful that when that law was made, there was little recognition of all the problems and the troubles that were going on within our district. And since time has changed and time has gone by, there's been recognition to look at the mess that was made and many efforts to clean up. And I'm along with Dr. Carter. It bothers me to know that our elected officials would be that blindsided and would be that stagnated that they would stay stuck as to what they did a couple of years ago, and it doesn't fit now. And if it doesn't fit, we've got to do something about it because it doesn't fit with what's going on. So most certainly it behooves them to look at what the recommendation is. That's all we're doing is a recommendation. And we can't stay stuck there. You know, we might have, said that I agree with this, and Marshall, I hear you saying that you've always been a proponent. I'm a proponent for what works and what's best in the best interest of our children. I'm a proponent for being in California where it's hot and not being here where it's cold. But the bottom line is I have a job to do here. And so we have to begin to look at some things you have to just change. And that's that flexibility that we have to look at. So if our legislatures are not flexible, that doesn't say a lot about them, and it doesn't say a lot about us who actually vote them into those seats. That we have people who are not willing to look at what's best and what's right and going from good to better to best. And I say that we put forth
and I don't like the word status quo either, is to look at what would be in the best interest of the district, best interest of the children, the community as a whole, and the CAB. Because when they talk about dollars and cents, and many times you say if it doesn't make dollars, it doesn't make sense. If you don't have an education, you can't make dollars nor cents. The other thing is that we have to begin to look at the fact that DeKalb County is not only being hurt academically and educationally, but economically. And I think that it would not be an economically sound decision to change up what we have is right. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when you know that you're going in the right direction. So I agree with Karen. I think that we might want to move forward and just look at what are the recommendations and move forward and take a vote, because I think we've talked about it long enough. And make the decision here at this particular time and make the recommendation. It's not behooving us. I never like to think for other people. We don't have that kind of power and authority, and I don't want to take that on. Let's give it to them and let them decide what they're going to do. You know, we're not getting paid to be legislators. We're here to be on the board and to govern this great district. So I think that we need to go ahead, pull it together, give it to them, and let them decide, and then we live with whatever the decision is made.
Yeah, I think we should stay with the law, the 7. I'm saying because of the implications that it has for SPLOST, because a significant portion of the populace has asked for 7. But I guess from a more pragmatic standpoint, or as well as a pragmatic point of view, I think the prospects of changing the legislation before the session ends to decouple, to take on that piece of legislation, as much effort and wrangling that went into it, to have it be successful in decoupling it from SPLOST, I think there is a low probability of it. I don't think there is a guarantee, certainly in the public's mind, that 9 will necessarily mean this 9, because when the election comes up, there are prospects that there will be, there are some concerns actually that some of the previous 9 will be back on board. So while I certainly appreciate all the work that we've done, I don't think swimming upstream on this particular law will be beneficial, but I do think the downside of it is that it will become fodder for public conversation via the press, and that would only serve as a further distraction from the work that we've got to get done. And so I don't think it would be fruitful.
My final say on it is I do support this body together. But just like my kids will say, Dad, can we go to Disney World next weekend? I'm like, do you understand what it takes for me to take y'all to Disney World? It's not just something like that. And so my analogy is for us to say, hey, we'd like to stay together. I know it's going to take a lot of work. We're asking you, our delegates, to drop everything you got, retool the legislation so that we can stay at 9, and uncouple the SPLOST legislation so that we can participate in SPLOST. To Mr. Mayfield's point, I think we're asking a lot. Now, if we had asked them at the beginning of the session, if we had this retreat or talk or in December, and come January 1 when legislators session started, and we had presented it, I think that would be a more realistic expectation to get to work. And y'all are our representatives of this board, and this is our recommendations, right? Our legislative recommendations. We've already sent one, right? A letter from Dr. Johnson about the equalization. So in theory, I do support 9. I think realistically, we're asking, and it will upset the apple cart from a legislative standpoint. But I support 9. I do. But realistically, that's asking a lot. So, thank you.
For the record, the vote will speak for itself. I think all of us are pretty much stating our position. I'll be very simple. I agree with moving forward with the 9. Asking the legislature to take a look at any decoupling. I understand your point, Mac, and that it's a little bit late, but I think, as Dr. Carter well said, we make a recommendation to them, this is where we like to stay. And so I'm all for the 9 and letting them determine if they over 7, and I do think we caveat it by saying we like the SPLOST and additional funding to be there, and if that's a taxation on us, then we know that 7 probably is the number more than 9, but I think we offer 9 saying we believe in what we're doing, and we try to move the district forward based on the 9 that we have now.
Let me take one more comment and then ask the chairman to entertain a motion, okay?
I actually wanted to see if our chair would be okay, since we're going to retreat in West Marlboro, we have a guest from Rockdale County.
No, decaf.
Oh, decaf, well, you've been around. I thought you'd had some observations.
But you said, this is a board's retreat.
Right.
And a board's retreat, if we get her citizen
No.
comment, we should have comment.
No,
Pro and
no, I'm not
everybody
looking-
else. That's what I'm saying.
No, my only point was not.
That's my position on it.
Yeah,
I know why you're saying it.
Try to
That's
reiterate.
okay. I just want to be fair to everybody.
Right, Dr. Johnson, my point is that we had some input that might help us understand what was going on in our world, but that's fine. I mean, again, to where we said, I think, particularly because we were at, I think, day 21 in the legislature, out of a 40-day session, right? Where to Thad's point, we were almost at crossover day, which also further constrains our ability. And I just think we have to deal, policy feelings aside, also with the practicalities of how the legislature works, and trying to get this all done in essentially 9 legislative days, and they're not skipping legislative days these days in order to get out of the legislature more quickly. I just don't think it was practical, in addition to the policy issues I have.
With that in mind, he was the last. All right, at this time, I would like for Margaret, now correct me, board members and Margaret, if I have different recommendations wrong. Okay. I have 1 to stay at 9, with the uncoupling portion being dealt with, that would not be antagonistic to the county. That's 1. I have 1, 2, I have 7 at-large seats. That was another recommendation. I have 7 seats by law that is present.
Individual, equally
Local
sized
laws,
district.
right. And the others, are there any others?
The only thing that I would add to the very first is the non-staggered term.
No, we've already.
No, we've already
that.
voted on that.
So
That's
that's a done deal.
Right.
We voted on that, and we voted on the tweak.
Right.
Yeah, we voted on that.
So that's the only 3?
So the only 3 we have. So, I'm sorry.
Just on the first one, with the 9 as is, with the change in the legislation to participate in SPLOST, my addition to that, and my recommendation, is that if the legislature decides that they cannot, I guess it's going to the 7th. I guess that's
Yeah,
what I'm
that's,
saying.
yeah,
They would default.
and I didn't see them, I didn't propose them as separate, I just proposed them as a priority list.
Right, if they
So
can't
9,
uncouple,
right.
then stay with SPLOST is the first thing.
Right.
No matter what we decide, or the legislature decides.
Correct.
And if you can do 9, please do. If you can't, 7 is, I think.
There are 2 7s, 7 at large, and there's 7 seats. Those are the 2 that we have. Okay. So, at this time, we'll take the first one. And if you will, please reread the recommendation.
Okay, the first recommendation is to keep it at 9 as long as the law can be changed to uncouple participate in SPLOST. If not, it falls to 7.
Any financial. So if there, let's
Oh,
say
sure.
there's, let's say there's something else hanging out there that has some things tied, any financial, such as SPLOST, and that way everybody's clear.
Or host, I guess.
Right.
SPLOST or host.
Yeah, that's why I said such as, any financial.
Any financial impact.
Negative impact, right.
Now, the last part I heard with that recommendation, you said, if not, then it falls to 7.
Then it defaults to the 7.
Should-
And then we'll vote on the at-large or
Then we can go to the second part, would it be 7 at large or 7 local? But do the first one first.
With that, I call for, who made that motion?
Well, I think the chair, the vice chair is having a conversation that may be related to this. I don't want to just the process, but maybe have implications.
One of them. We should have moved back. I am the attorney of the day.
That recommendation was made by Dr.
You got to look at it. We're not sure.
Dr. Martin.
And I believe the second.
The junior guy always gets the Saturdays. Right. That's right. I said,
Jimmy
like I
Mack.
said, the attorney.
We're in the middle of
It's
the
a
vote.
problem.
The recommendation, we have a recommendation.
Always gets the Saturdays.
I was just getting clarity on that SPLOST legislation.
Saturday morning,
But again, we've used the language that's broad enough to take care of it.
Any
When you say any financial, trust me, I draft it.
Negative impact, that's it.
And Dr. Irwin second.
Okay.
All right, second by Dr. Irwin. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, at this time, I'll call for the vote. Let me know by show of hands, all in favor.
You need
All
higher?
right, you have-
I can't see.
6.
Oh, we gotta pick up
All right.
Okay, we have all opposed. You have the names?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
The oppositions are Coleman, Orson, and McMahan, and passes 6-3.
No,
I'm sorry, Mayfield, and I wrote it right, I just said it wrong. I apologize, excuse me. It passes 63.
Okay. The next vote,
The second
the
recommendation.
second recommendation, the 7 at-large seats. That means, who made that recommendation? You.
You did. But if you need a second, I'll second.
I make the motion.
I'll second.
Now that's a
Second.
legislature.
It's been moved and second, that we have the 7 at-large seats. Is there any discussion? Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I call for the vote. Let me know by show of hands.
All in favor? Is that?
All in favor?
Not countywide voting for 7 seats.
That's what you're voting on right now.
All right, all opposed? Okay.
You got that one?
Yes, it failed,
Fail, okay.
4-5.
Okay. The next recommendation, 7 seats by law.
And who made the motion?
I think
So moved.
moved by Mr. Orson, seconded by Mr.
Just to be
Mayfield.
clear, we're
What is this?
reduced to 7 seats on this one.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
this
if
is,
they
this is,
abide by the current.
By the current law.
Second by?
Mayfield.
Mr. Mayfield. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, call for the vote. All in favor, let me know by show of hands.
hold on, David's
David,
missing.
we gotta wait for Mr. Coleman.
Campbell.
Mayfield,
The letter, C and C and M and N.
To 7 seats by
Yeah,
current law.
yeah.
Okay.
Can you recall that vote, please?
Okay, I recall the vote. All in favor?
This is,
Did we
7,
get
yes,
that?
status law.
We have a
Of the
motion.
7 local, all in favor, let me know by show of hands.
Okay.
All right.
All
All opposed? Okay, it passes,
8-1.
8-1. So that will be the recommendation to our legislators.
1 and 2.
1 and 3 will be the recommendation to the legislators.
Have Ms. Francois just briefly read back all the things that we're recommending, just to make sure we understood them correctly.
From the beginning,
Margaret,
Yeah, from the very first vote.
Okay, the very first vote, give me 1 second to find it. Okay, the very first vote, recommended by Dr. Carter, second by Dr. Irwin, to keep all 9 districts and drop the staggered terms. That was a 9-0 vote.
Well, we voted on the staggered terms
That's
first.
that's not voting on 9 districts.
No, that was not 9 districts. That was just
Staggered
It was
terms.
just, okay, I'm sorry, thank you.
So we are, the first vote, in my opinion,
It's just to keep, drop the staggered terms.
correct. We're gonna have no staggered,
Non-staggered 4-year terms.
non-staggered 4-year terms,
Okay,
starting 1/1/15, ending 12/31/18. That's standard, just for clarity.
okay. The second is to move, for the terms to begin January 15, ending December 2018.
That was part of the.
That's part of
That's part of
non-staggered,
that one, okay.
yeah.
So that's all I'm doing.
Right.
And then this last one that I
There was a
had.
second.
The district.
The tweak,
The tweaking.
Oh,
We got
that's
tweak.
right, the tweaking to move, hold on. The part in District 4 back to District 2.
No,
No,
opposite.
from 2 to 4.
From 2 to 4.
Oh, gosh,
moving a portion of District 2
back to 4.
back to 4, which the boundaries are Claremont and La Vista. Correct.
So it's,
I got one wrong. And
You
then
had
this
all
last-
And the two recommendations related to the district changes.
The first one is, 9 as it is, with the change in law to affect, with the change in law that defaults negative impact to financial, SPLOST or host programs. And the second one is
I think she put any.
Yeah,
any financial,
Any
for example,
negative
SPLOST.
impact.
For example,
Financial
SPLOST or
negative.
host.
Right.
And then the second is, to have 7 local districts,
So that,
which was 1 and 3.
so the impact of those last two is if there were financial ramifications or if the legislature decided
It would
not
default
to
to
keep
two.
it 9, it would default to 7 geographically defined. Is that correct?
Which is the current legislature.
Current